Hello, everybody, and welcome to this new conversations in our series, Democracy Promoted After Afghanistan at Hertie School of Governance. My name is Alina Mungiu-Pippidi. I am the Professor of Democracy Studies at Hertie School, and I will be your moderator for the following hour of conversation between our two very distinguished guests, both former ministers, although in quite different fields. One is Professor Bálint Magyar from Central European University, a former Minister of Education twice, and an activist for human rights and democracy in Hungary, actually from prior to 1989. And the second is the distinguished judge Sergio Moro, who became a universal celebrity by prosecuting the very impact high case, the Lava Jato, the car wash operations, which brought down presidents not only in Brazil, but across a score of Latin American countries, and which had since also tried to be directly involved in government in a temporary spell as Minister of Justice. Now, both are currently more on the academic side of things, so we thought it is really a very good moment to discuss with them. The moment is interesting. Brazil has forthcoming elections. Hungary, unfortunately, just had elections, and the elections were won by the president of the Fidesz party, Mr. Viktor Orban, despite the fact that he is negatively indexed by the European Union as an enemy of rule of law. So here we are, we have these two cases, quite extreme in many ways. Hungary was considered in the 90s a really big success of democracy consolidation and of good governance. And Brazil was considered, when Lava Jato started, to be a fantastic hope for the entire continent of Latin America and a model of how to do things. Yet it does seem that people who lead anti-corruption campaigns do not end up by leading these countries. And in more ways than one, the battle towards good governance seems to be very long and protracted. And this is what we're trying to find out from these two guests of ours. I like to remind people who join us for the first time in this conversation that this conversation is just a dialogue between the two guests moderated by me, and the audience is invited to use the chat very early on to put questions or make polite comments or share links to information or anything else you care to share. But you will not speak in this conversation. It's a short 1 hour conversation from now on. So let me start with Hungary, because it was all over the news in Europe, big disappointment, and the European Commission has already started the procedure, the so-called new rule of law procedure, thinking on how to cut Hungarian funds due to the elections of Mr. Orban. However, news changed from one day to another, and due to Mr. Orban's boycott of oil on Putin, it may be that he actually is in a position to blackmail European Union and get his money back. So what is the state of rule of law in Hungary now? And is rule of law really problematic in Hungary, or it's just because we do not like Orban, because he's this character against immigrants who really tries to shut down the press he doesn't like, and therefore we generalize and we say he's an enemy of rule and law, and he's only a bad guy who wins elections, though?
Well, Hungary is an autocracy. And of course, before 2010, Orban had already some autocratic attempt, but in 2008-9, there was an economic and financial and political crisis in Hungary, as a result of which, on the elections of 2010, Orban's party, the Fidesz, with 53% of the votes, they gained 67% of the seats in the parliament. This was an autocratic breakthrough. Autocratic breakthrough means that one single political force can create the monopoly of political power for itself, because with 67% of the seats, which is a supermajority in the Hungarian parliament, a single political actor can change the constitution alone and appoint the leaders and main officers of all institutions which should serve as the institutions of checks and balances in a democracy. And when it happened, this autocratic breakthrough at 2010, the new constitution, what they created just alone without any consultation and cooperation with opposition forces, they created it and accepted it in 2011. Since that time comes the third phase, namely the autocratic consolidation, which means that this autocratic power brings into under its own control and power practically other spheres of the society, the economic, the communal sphere, the media, and so on, and it's lasting. So now we have an autocratic regime in Hungary, which can be characterized such a way, for example, that the rule of law was replaced by rule by law, but not simply rule by law. In this last years, in the last 3-4 years, rule by government decrees. And even now, we had in the last 4 years different types of state of emergency status, which means that the government, even without its 2/3 majority in the parliament, can bring decrees which break the existing laws and constitution and goes against this. And while in the beginning, a few years ago, the state of emergency was referred to the danger of migration, the wave of migration. The next was the pandemic danger. And now, as an only country in the European Union, we declared, yesterday, Orban declared a status of emergency because of the war in the neighborhood in Ukraine, in spite of the fact that the whole campaign of him now was built on that slogan that we do not intervene in this war, and it's not our business, and not the Hungarian people should pay the price of this war. So now practically he has a very easy job, I would say, because it's a personalist leadership. But of course, another question that what kind of autocracy it is, because there are different types of autocracies in the world and even within the EU, because, for example, the Polish autocratic attempt, which is not still an autocracy, it's while a conservative bureaucratic one, I call the Hungarian one a patronal autocracy, because it means that there is a patronalization of the society in such a way that he builds up patron-client relations. The question is that what does it mean, patronalization? It means there are 4 major layers of this patronalization process. The first is that the decision-making is taken out from the dominance of formal institutions into informal ones. So now the main decision-making body in quotation mark, I would say, this is the chief patron's court, I would say, which consists of, around Orban, which consists of persons with formal and informal positions. The second layer is that the normative regulations are replaced by discretional ones. So this rule by government decrees practically is a discretional regulation and rule within the country. The third layer is that the collective type of authorization is replaced by personal authorization and loyalty chains of patron-client relations. And the fourth is that the bureaucratic or institutional chains of dependency are replaced by clientelist personal chains of dependency. And it means that this patron-client relations within the society, from the top until to the bottom of the society, overweight the society, and these are really stable. These create a really stable system of dependency against which is very difficult to step up.
Thank you very much. So emergency rulings, informal subversion of official positions, and basically clientelization of important parts of society by discretionary uses of resources. This seemed to be the very successful recipe of the spin dictator, as Daniel Treisman and Sergei Guriev call the kind of leaders in their recent book, of people who use with skill all these formulas so they don't have to use arrests as, all-time dictators. They simply masterfully use this kind of all manipulations procedures. Now let's see what happened in Brazil, where actually the Lava Jato was officially closed, I think, already a while ago. And one of the most successful convictions was overturned by a Supreme Court, which ruled on grounds of jurisdiction, but not as you would expect at the beginning of the trial, but after a final sentence was given, which is, of course, nobody's definition of rule of law in the civilized world. So how much of a blow is this to the whole effort, and what is its consistent legacy, and what goes on now? I mean, is this a Brazil after Lava Jato, or is it still the Brazil before?
Hello. First of all, let me say that I'm thankful for being invited for this meeting. Thank you, Alina. Thank you, Professor Bálint, to join this meeting. Well, the situation in Brazil is very complex. We had in car wash operation, Lava Jato, a big change in Brazil in the way that the courts of justice apply the law. The problem in Brazil about grand corruption was never the law. The problem was that the law was never applied. We lack the enforcement of the criminal law against these cases of grand corruption. And the Lava Jato case changed the environment, and we start to see these big fishes going to be tried and to be sent to prison because of taking bribes or paying bribes. They have done this systematically for years in large sums of money. We have a corrupted democracy, to be very clear about that. In 2018, we had elections, and unfortunately, in my opinion, the political system failed in present a candidate that believe that this force against corruption needs to continue, that the right path would be the consolidation of the force against corruption, because all of this is important for our democracy, for our economy, and for our institutions. The political system failed in producing a candidate. And then we had the election of Bolsonaro, who was someone, he was a congressman for 20 years, but he presented himself as an outsider. He won the election, and at that time, he prayed in favor of the car wash operation. But once in power, he abandoned the efforts against the fight against corruption. He started to undermine the rule of law. He's a kind of a right populist, okay? And because the fight against corruption was weakened, we start to see the branches of the government, the judiciary, the Congress, and the executive issuing decisions that undermined the work that have been done during the car wash case. And one of these setbacks was the decision by our Supreme Court, the Brazilian Supreme Court, that overruled on technical grounds the conviction of the former President Lula. That was a decision very difficult to understand, because the former President Lula was arrested to serve prison term in the beginning of 2018, and the arrests have been made only because the Brazilian Supreme Court denied a petition of habeas corpus presented by the defense of Lula. So for everyone in 2018, everyone believes, wow, that's it. You have a decision by the Supreme Court. You have the conviction not only from a judge of the first instance, but also from appeal court. and he was arrested. He was serving prison term, and suddenly 3 years later, the same Supreme Court decided that the conviction needed to be overruled. One of the reasons was that it should be have been tried in another court and not in the court of Curitiba, where I was at the bench at that time. Lula is, in my opinion, a populist, but from the left. And now we have a strong polarization in our election in Brazil. One populist from the right, Bolsonaro, one populist from the left, and without much space to the center of the politics. And no one of them, not Lula and not Bolsonaro, are worried about the rule of law, about the fight against corruption, in favor of preserving the achievements that we made during the car wash operation. Unfortunately, also, we have our courts and our Congress not exactly in favor of these flags also. So Brazil is not in a very good situation at this moment. There is some hope that a center candidate could appear with more commitment with democracy and the rule of law. But the moment we are seeing a setback in our commitment to the rule of law and democracy.
Well, that's pretty grim. But may I ask what happens with, for instance, civil society, judicial activism? I think that what impressed the world very much in Lava Jato was this judicial activism that we have seen, you know, from you, from prosecutors, from some people in the federal police. There's been obviously some mobilization, and I think that the success must have convinced people of the power which exists in these organizations. I mean, is there no conscious movement among magistrates in favor of continuing this and of ending the political impunity which had reigned in Brazil previous to this investigation?
Well, nowadays there's a lot of indignation about what is happening, because it was not only Lula. The Supreme Court started to deliver decisions that undermine other efforts against corruption. Let me give an example. Bribery and money laundering crimes, they were tried because of our law before the federal courts. The federal courts, like my own at the time when I was a judge, we are able to investigate and try these complex crimes. But suddenly in the beginning, in 2019, our Supreme Court, the Brazilian Supreme Court, by a majority, let me be fair, a not strong majority, decided that these cases, when it involves a politician, need to be tried before an electoral court. This was a new rule, a new understanding about the meaning of the law. And they started to apply this new judgment, this new rule, retroactively, overruling every conviction of politicians that were made in the car wash operation. So this was very sad. The point is that during the car wash operation, when the case was on the press, when we have a lot of support from public opinion, we are able to face all these attempts of obstruction of justice, of the position of the courts of justice, sometimes a little bit lenient with corruption, considering our tradition of impunity. But when car wash started to disappear from the news, because, well, any kind of investigation has a beginning, the middle, and the end, we started to lose support from the public opinion, and that for the forces of the status quo of impunity started to get strained. So today, of course, there is a lot of indignation. I believe half of a great part of the country does not agree with the annulment of Lula conviction. This will be an issue, of course, in the election. But in a strange way, the relief of Lula to be present at the polls brought more benefits to his adversary, Bolsonaro, helping to consolidate the polarization. And Bolsonaro was one of the responsibles, in my opinion, to not give the backup of to the fight against corruption as he had promised during the election in 2018. So it's a very complex situation. There are a lot of support on there is support in the civil society and by the public opinion in favor of anti-corruption, but not enough to undermine the efforts of the status quo of impunity.
Yes, I see, pretty grim. I have to ask a challenging question here, because it's been a lot of discussion, as you are very well aware. I mean, beyond the evidence, which I think it's rather clear on Mr. Lula, nevertheless, there were comments that prosecutors had colluded with you in a sense. They presented to you in advance their arguments in order to make sure that you're going to sign your warrants. And the leak of this conversation was very much used by supporters of Lula to show that in fact everything against him had been politically motivated. So how many people really believe that this anti-campaign was, I mean, we are a public in Western universities, we don't matter, right? We are the rule of law educated public. How many people really believe that this is an objective cause which is worth endorsed? And how many people, in fact, believe that it was politically motivated and the corruption really matters only when it happens in the other political camp?
No, in my opinion, we had a strong movement by the Brazilians in favor of the rule of law and anti-corruption. This was not only motivated because of partisanship on the political field. We had in 2016, for example, more than 3 million of Brazilians went to the streets to protest against the corruption, the widespread corruption, the impunity. So this was very sincere. Of course, when you have a case against a politician, usually the politician try to use in his defense the argument that the accusation is biased, the juiz is biased, everything is politically motivated. But the facts that were revealed by the car wash operation, they are real. Let me give you, for example, information. Petrobras, which was the main victim, a state-owned company, the main victim of the criminal scheme, publicly revealed that it was able to recover about $1 billion in damages because of the investigation made by Lava Jato, recover bribes that have been paid involving its contracts. And there was never any kind of collusion between me and the prosecutors. The point is that we have a different tradition, judicial tradition here in Brazil. So it's common that a judge speak with the lawyer, a judge speak with the prosecutor. And the judge in Brazil, he has the responsibility to preside the trial and give his judgment, but also he's necessary to allow certain investigative measures during the investigation phase. So this kind of change of exchange of declarations or things like that with the prosecutors, they are not uncommon. And if you look to the details about what they said, there is no false evidence used in the case of Lula. There is no evidence that have been omitted that could prove his innocence or something like that. There is a strong case because all this corruption happened during the Workers' Party government, and we have a lot of evidence that show all the responsibles of this criminal scheme. I can assure that never anything improper was made in the case of Lula. Of course, they use this kind of alibi that it was everything politically motivated, but that's not true.
Just a follow-up question, since I've just seen it on chat. Have you personally come under attack these days?
Yes, this is crazy. Let me give you an example. Some members of the Workers' Party, they present
which is Mr. Lula's party, yes, please.
Yeah, Lula's party. Well, I'm suffering attacks since the beginning of the car wash operation. But for example, in these last days, they present a civil action against me, asking for damages. And the allegation is a little bit crazy, but the allegation is that Lava Jato was prejudicial to the economy of Brazil, the fight against corruption, closed companies, closed jobs. So they want to request damages against me. This is something totally crazy.
That's very interesting. Yes, very interesting. So actually corruption can be seen as beneficial for an economy, and maybe this is why certain voters, don't really care very much for the corruption of Mr. Orban now returning to Hungary. Also certain foreign investors, because when you see BMW and other companies coming and investing in Hungary, while you have this discourse in the European institutions that this is a country which is totally under the radar for rule of law, that's pretty strange. So who is on the side of rule of law actually in Hungary?
In a patronal autocracy, the situation is very bad because as the political power is monopolized, then there is a single pyramid patronal network, single pyramid patron client network, and which is at the end a kind of criminal state. This is what I call mafia state. It's not an ordinary type of corruption, not even in quotation mark, the more developed type of it that oligarchs capture the state. It's just the opposite. In this case, a political enterprise captures the economy and captures the oligarchs themselves. So in Eastern Europe, for example, in Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, in these countries that even beyond the EU, in Ukraine, we can speak about patronal democracies, which means that different patron-client networks are fighting each other under the cover of political parties, but none of them is in a situation that they could monopolize their power, none of them that they could liquidate or subordinate the other patron-client networks to themselves. But it was not the case in Hungary, and this is mainly the result of the very disproportionate election system and the non-divided executive power that we do not have as a directly elected president, which could be a kind of counterbalance to the government itself. The president is just a puppet of the prime minister in Hungary. Now, if you have such a single pyramid patron-client network, then the state is operated itself as a criminal organization. And this is what, for example, in the EU, they cannot realize. So in most of the cases, they want to give advices to the government how to fight against corruption, but it's really ridiculous because the monopolist actor of corruption in Hungary, not in the traditional form, is the government itself, is this patron-client network. So this is when they have, for example, sensational programs to teach the Hungarian government to fight corruption. This is something like they would try to teach a lion to be vegetarian, and at the end of the course, the lion should eat the educator. So in Hungary, therefore, the chief prosecutor himself is a part of this criminal organization. So therefore, even if the judiciary is partly independent, only partly in Hungary, but the corrupt cases cannot get into the phase that the judiciary, the court, could decide about these things, to start these processes, because the chief attorney's office blocks all these things. And when there are some corruption cases which are at the judiciary, what happened in the last year, these are so-called partisan corruptions, when these are unauthorized corruption cases, or such corruption cases which are not managed by the criminal state itself, and therefore, of course, it fights, like in a classic mafia, where they do not let any kind of competition within their territory. And now, for the mafia state in Hungary, its territory, the country, is the country itself. So therefore, practically, there are no real constraints of harassing civic organizations, NGOs who would fight against corruption. And there were a lot of campaigns from the side of the government to fight against these NGOs, you know. And the last thing is what happened just a day ago, that the parliament, with this two-thirds majority of the Fidesz, its criminal state, they accepted a law which entitled the State Account Office to investigate the NGOs, those NGOs which are carrying, now I literally say what is in the law, that which are carrying out an activity capable of influencing public life. But the NGO's task is to influence public life. So practically now they created the legal construction for being able to find, to harass, to punish these NGOs.
Okay, but we are, I have to disclose something for some of our guests who do not know. I'm an East European, so I'm really, used to this grim realities. And I would say that the situation in Romania, Bulgaria, and Slovakia is perhaps a little bit closer to Hungary. I mean, they also had monopolies. The question is, when is the observation standpoint? Mr. Borisov enjoyed a de facto monopoly for many years in Bulgaria, right? And now he was arrested. Okay, so they were in the streets against him for nearly 3 years, until they finally managed to create a new party, and the new party to win elections. But at a certain point, he was the longest office holder in the European Union, longer than Angela Merkel. So I would call this quite a monopoly, and still he's down. And in Romania, we had two successive monopolies. First of SDP, the former Communist Party, and then of Băsescu's party. He was over 10 years. And now, he's sentenced by a court. His former lover is chased across border. Yes. Even his children are in jail. I'm just saying this to encourage you, okay? So it does happen.
Well, it's not necessary. I'm just a realist, In these countries, the election law is much great extent proportionate. Proportional. That's true. So therefore, none of these governments in those countries had the possibility to change the election law as they wished to change it. What happened in Hungary? The Orban government changed more than 100 times the election law, all the time, even few months before the elections, So this is why, for example, I do not like the term free but not fair elections, because if you amputate somebody's one leg, and then you say that you are led to run on a foot race, you should not say that you are free to run. Okay, it's not so fair that I cut down one of your leg. In Hungary, as they permanently changed the election law, and there were for example, the government just 1 month before the elections helicoptered a huge amount of money to the people, which equaled about 3.5% of the GDP. It was just a gift, In the public media, the opposition parties altogether had one time 5 minutes, and nothing else. So it's a real autocracy, while in these countries, even if they could cement themselves, one or the other party for a few terms, you know, but they are, according to me, they are still still patronal democracies, in that sense that the different patron-client networks fighting each other, they create some possibility for more autonomous positions between them in this fight, not to be everybody subordinated under one single pyramid patronal network.
Well, but you have Budapest, don't you? I mean, the mayor of Budapest is in opposition.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, so that's not a full monopoly. Let's be a little bit more optimistic.
But in the case of state of emergency, they took away, the government took away the schools from the local governments. They took away the whole healthcare from the local government. They cut back their resources and even prohibited for the cities, for the local governments to raise taxes. So there is a direct move from the government to create a financial crisis in these cities and to bring them into such a patron-client network that with discretional gifts to certain local governments, they could rule them practically. So formally you have opposition leadership in this or the another town, but the government centrally empties out the real competencies and resources of these local governments. Such changes need two-thirds majority in the parliament, and the Orban government always have. For example, after the first election and the second one in 2014, when they changed unilaterally the election law, they got only, in quotation mark, I say only 44% of the votes. But this 44% of the votes, they had again 67% of the seats. So they could maintain the monopoly of political power.
Yes, I see. And that is why it's so important who controls constitutional courts and Supreme Courts, because everything that you tell me seems very, unconstitutional in any democracy. So normally you would expect that this is challenging courts and it doesn't hold. Okay, but of course I know it was a big fight on who controls constitutional courts. And I'd like to return to Judge Moro because we have a lot of questions on the chat. And the questions are about the politicization of the Supreme Court. So do you consider that the decision of the Supreme Court was in part influenced by politics? And you also cited the second important decision of Supreme Court, the one which actually sent to only a special court all the politicians, basically removing the accident which you had represented in the past. You know, the accident of somebody in a federal court who could go against politicians for such oppositions. Do you think that these are politicized moves, and is there a certain party which pushed to this, or is actually a consensus against big parties that this is very dangerous for them and therefore it has to end?
Well, there was what we saw in Brazil was a political reaction against the anti-corruption movement, a very strong one. Part of the setbacks came from the courts, especially from our Supreme Court. Let me say again, always by a majority. So there are some members of the Supreme Court who had strong commitment in favor of anti-corruption, but now they are in a minority. Okay, we have also some setbacks came in from the Congress, the Brazilian Congress. They approved some new laws that undermine the fight against corruption, and also some laws that brought a deterrent effect against prosecutors who, for example, try to fight corruption or bringing strong cases against politicians. And a part of the setbacks came from the government, the executive itself. One point that was mentioned here by Professor Bálint, the prosecutor, if you control the general prosecutor, if you control the attorney general, who is the responsible to present cases of grand corruption, in certain way you could control the agenda of the courts of justice. In Brazil, we have a stand privilege. It's something that we need to revoke, to overrule, but we have a stand privilege. That means that congressmen, senate, deputies, ministers, the president himself, and justice of the Supreme Court, they could only be investigated by the Attorney General, or they only could suffer criminal charges by the act of the Attorney General. So if you have an Attorney General who does not have a strong commitment against corruption and grand corruption, if you don't have an Attorney General who is brave enough to face the challenges of going against powerful politicians or powerful businessmen, everything comes to be very hard. During the Lava Jato operation in 2014 until 2017, we have attorney generals and prosecutors who are they have a very strong position against corruption. That is not the case anymore in Brazil. So we are seeing a lot of, again, as it happened in the past, a lot of political scandals at the newspapers, but without consequences at the courts of justice, sometimes because the case is not even brought to the attention of the courts. But yes, I would agree that I believe all this was a political movement against accountability, against the fight against corruption, and undermine the quality of our economy and the quality of our democracy.
Somebody else asks on the chat. I also asked this in the beginning, and I think you partly answered, but maybe the answer is actually not so negative. So what is actually the legacy of Lava Jato? What stands after it, except this some assets recovery? What do you think is the lasting legacy? Because what you described is counterreactions.
No, Lava Jato brought a wave of anti-corruption, especially in Latin America and in Africa. Let me give you an example. I was living in the United States last year. I was walking through the sidewalks of Georgetown, and suddenly a man passed through me and started to speak with me in strange Portuguese. And he said, "Well, I recognize you. I recognize you. You are." And I said, "Well, let me give you a help. Sergio Moro." I said who I was. And the guy said, "Oh, I'm from Angola. I'm a big fan of Lava Jato. The evidence that you shared with my country helped to undermine the power of the former president, José Eduardo Santos. We have a great impact also in Peru with the former presidents receiving bribes. I believe we open new possibilities of extraterritorial jurisdiction in the world, and even from more internal cooperation against corruption. And the main lesson is to Brazil is that, corruption is not something from nature. It's not a manifest destiny to Brazil. We could fight corruption. We could build a better country. We could have better institutions, but everything depends on the political will, and we depends on the public opinion. We depends on the population to give the support to prosecutors, to judges, to do their work. And fortunately, in Brazil, when we have a change and the public opinion starts to lose attention on the fight against corruption, we started to suffer political setbacks from the powerful ones, the ones who rule the country, and the ones who get used with the status quo of impunity. We have this tradition for more than a century in Brazil, so it's not not that easy to break this tradition. But I believe even in Brazil, with these setbacks, the car wash operation showed that a different world is different. And let me say, until now, I have a lot of popular support here in Brazil. Lava Jato also has a lot of political support. So I believe in proper time, we could have new developments against grand corruption in Brazil and in favor of the rule of law and democracy. There's no, we haven't lose the battle.
Yeah, not at all, not at all. That's just one point. This is what I think about Hungary as well. I mean, we're in a difficult moment, but it's not that the battle is lost. And we're talking about the same thing, really. We're talking state capture, isn't it? Because what many politicians want is to preserve rents such as Petrobras, to exploit them in turn. Whoever comes to government needs this kind of levers in order to keep client constituencies and to survive in power. So they're not different mechanisms that we're discussing. It is the same mechanism. Only Mr. Orban seemed to have been particularly successful for the past 10 years. But let me ask you just 1 second. I will stay more in Brazil because we have many chat questions. Okay, so it seems to me that yes, as it was to be expected, politicians mobilized against, that's always the case. But it's always, we know that anti-corruption is instrumentalized. I mean, we know from Italy that, a lot of good people who were prosecutors didn't end up very well, and a lot of politicians escaped. So what is needed is some collective action, political collective action, some follow-up, this center force, which is technocratic, this anti-system but not populist party, to come and win a constituency. And I see that some people would actually encourage you to join such a force or create such a force, while others actually say that your decision to enter politics only brought discredit to anti-corruption and allowed more instrumentalization of anti-corruption, because you are suspected to have been politically motivated all along. Now, where do you stand today on this? I mean, do you think that this capital of support can be still used in a good sense?
Yes, I think the point is that, of course, we can complain about the situation. We could make the necessary critiques, but you need to work politically to bring back these flags. So nowadays, I made a decision to go to the politics, but let me say this very clearly. The responsibilities for the setbacks against the anti-corruption movement relies not in the prosecutors, not in the judges, not in my shoulders here, because we did our part, we did our work, and it was we took a lot of risks in doing that. The blame for the setbacks should be looked to the politicians, to the justice, to the judges that came later and undermine these efforts. We can't make this kind of, the blame is on the prosecutor, the ambitious prosecutor, the blame is in the ambitious judge. No, we did our job. When I delivered a sentence, I was convinced that someone committed a crime, a corruption crime, and need to suffer the consequences. And all my decisions were upheld by the appeal court, by the superior courts, until one time when the political tide changed, the political wave changed in disfavor of anti-corruption. What we need to do? We need to recover the anti-corruption movement, the anti-corruption will, and for that we need leadership in politics. I believe if Brazil had the lucky to elected in 2018 someone with more commitment with the rule of law, with the fight against corruption, things would be very different from the situation that we are seeing today. But when you elect a populist, if he's from the right, if he's from the left, unfortunately, they don't live very well with the restraints that anti-corruption movement or anti-corruption work usually brings to them. For example, I believe I'm not a specialist in Hungary, but as far as I know, I believe if the institutions were working against corruption in Hungary, probably the situation would be different for the ones who held power then. It's the same case in Brazil. If these institutions were working like they were working during the Lava Jato operation, we would not have Lula or Bolsonaro running for elections.
Yeah, but aren't Lula, Bolsonaro, and Orban running for elections? Because there are millions of people who really do not care that they are corrupt or abusive. And they vote for them, you know, and the idea that we only have 2 hours to tell these people that these guys are bad, I do not buy it. I mean, the Hungarian constituency is highly educated, rather economic autonomous, and has exposed to social media. So I really doubted that they didn't hear that Orban is a bad guy, or he gives money to his local village and to his school pals. It's quite impossible that this didn't reach them. It's simply advantages somehow for these constituencies seem to be more important than the moral judgment on this character. And I think that's the problem, how to build constituencies. And I return to the Hungarian example. Is there anything more than the European Union could do, and anything more that it doesn't backfire? Because I'm not sure that in the past the European involvement was on one hand very effective or in time or timely, and on the second hand I'm not sure there are not counter reactions. You know, Hungarians are proud, are fairly nationalistic. Maybe they don't like Brussels to tell them for whom to vote. So is there anything from outside that that we can do, create this bigger constituency to overcome the voting system, which, by the way, is so different from the German voting system?
Yes, yes. Well, I think that the policy, anti-corruption policy of the EU concerning Hungary is not a good one at all. You know, if I would like to compare, let us say, the US sanctions and the EU sanctions, the main difference is that the US sanctions, they fight against the perpetrator. These are like GPS-led missiles, you know, they are going to the perpetrators, freezing their accounts, not letting them into the US, according to the Magnitsky law, etc. Like in the EU sanctions, they are like carpet bombing. You know, they punish the civilian population, and there is a bad background assumption behind this, because they assume that Hungary is a democracy. If the EU funds will not come, then it will press the government to change the policy. But it's not the case at all. This is a criminal organization, and I think until it won't be compulsory to join the EU attorney's office to Olaf by the side of Hungary and any other country, until that this blackmailing power what Hungary has with this veto right, what should be abolished, I think, within the EU, because it destroys the EU. You know, Hungary has 1% of the GDP of the whole EU GDP, and they want to decide that living with this blackmailing power such a way, then it won't change. The Hungarian criminal state is financed by the EU. The EU funds are these regimes' oil and gas reserves. What it serves in Russia, you know, just financing this monopoly of patron-client network in Russia and some Central Asian countries. The EU funds reach 4 or 5% of the GDP, yearly GDP, and about 8–10% of the budget. It's such a huge amount of money that you cannot win any elections if such a criminal organization, what is called the Hungarian government, anybody could win against them. So therefore, the EU, I think now, especially in the light of the Russian aggression, the challenge, what does it mean for the EU? And that it's like a bad condominium, you know, when there is one crazy renter, you know, just can destroy the whole community because hacking all the necessary steps, what should be done, it should be finished. And I think now we are around this turning point.
Right. So personalized sanctions, actually, EU has the legal basis and has done some personalized sanctions, but very, very few compared to United States. Personalized sanctions for Hungary would be the solution and not kind of carpet bombs. What about international influence in Brazil, Sergio? Is there anything we can do to first, to cut the opportunities of the bad guys? I think the idea of somehow cutting, if there are any rents which are subsidized by profits abroad, should we do something about them, or should individual sanctions be conceived? I can tell you that there are some Americans you probably know who are very keen these days on sanctions and would give sanctions anywhere if sanctions could be effective.
No, I'm not sure sanctions would be against Brazil because of that. No, I hope that we will not have more threats in the future against our democracy. I hope this will not happen. But we are talking about the legacy of the car wash operation, and certainly this also is related with your question. One thing that was a good consequence, a very good consequence of the force of the car wash operation is that we saw great investment made by the private sector in anti-bribery policies, especially in compliance programs against the practice of corruption in Brazil. So we saw this increase. And also the car wash operation, because it had all these international repercussions, it brought attention to the private sector in Brazil for extraterritorial jurisdiction. So we have some Brazilian companies that need to make settlements before the SEC in the United States or the DOJ United States, and also with Switzerland authorities adopting, compromising themselves to adopt anti-corruption policies inside. So nowadays the private sector in Brazil is much more well developed, at least in favor of integrity, than it was before the car wash operation. This is also a very good consequences. But we could think about ways that we could improve our system. In politics, for example, I was defending here the creation of a national anti-corruption court as the model of, I believe, Slovenia and Ukraine before the war. Maybe if the courts of justice in Brazil, they are not doing well in their work against corruption, maybe we could think about creating a new court. Of course, there is the details that need to be discussed. And there is this discussion, that about the creation of an international anti-corruption court. We know that this is in the beginning, and maybe it will not happen, I'm not sure. But maybe it could be a tool that could help inside the country's efforts to build a more strong anti-corruption movement.
Well, thank you. I think you already mentioned the tool which is working, which is the American enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act, right? I know Petrobras had to settle for a very big amount, and now you tell us that new companies have to settle. So there is some positive international influence. And for the rest, I'd like to end by saying that what I take out from this discussion is that although the situation is in many ways grim in these two countries, however, these are not countries where people are arrested and killed. Perhaps one reason is that there is no need to do this from the part of these dictators. They can manipulate the situation otherwise. But as long as freedom of association exists and there is some avenue to express ourselves, I think the big challenge is how to mobilize majorities in favor of rule of law, how to create collective action and have political vehicles which would convince people and overturn any sort of electoral system. Because if people really want to change things, they will. They will, as long as opposition politicians are free to stand in elections, okay? Because we're not yet in some countries of sub-Saharan Africa where anti-corruption actually arrests the main contenders. This has not happened yet. So we just have to continue, and of course, as internationals, to think of what is more efficient, but in the same time proportional to help pro-rule of law constituencies in these countries without of course, getting involved in the internal politics. I'd like to thank both of you very much. I'd like to thank our audience, people who put questions on chat, and to also say hello for the year. This is the last talk of the democracy series for this year at Hertie School. So I hope to see everyone back in September, and I really hope that I will be able to invite our two lecturers also to Berlin. So not on Zoom next time. That is the hope.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure again.
Thank you.
Great to
Thank you.
talk with both.